There's a version of this movie that scares me more than the one I just watched. And it's not because it's bloodier, more graphic, or even louder. It's scarier because it would have forced this franchise to finally sit with something it's been skirting around for a really, really long time. What happens when the infected aren't the main problem anymore? Not because they're gone, not because they're cured, but because the rules around them start to change. 28 years later, the Bone Temple wants to live in that neighborhood. I just don't think it commits to the most dangerous version of the idea. And by the end of this video, I want to walk through what I ultimately think the film is reaching for, where it pulls back, and what different choices might have actually reshaped this franchise in a way that followed through on the promise of last year's 28 years later. Hang with me. What's up, my know-it-alls? Okay, so today I want to talk through 28 years later, The Bone Temple. This one's directed by Nia DaCosta, written by Alex Garland, starring Ray Fiennes, Jack O'Connell, and Alfie Williams, with a brief but meaningful cameo at the very end. This is the second film in the now titled 28 trilogy. It picks up immediately after last year's 28 years later. Before we get into it, quick housekeeping. There are timestamps in the description if you want to jump around. This isn't going to be a reaction, and this definitely isn't going to be a recap, but we are going to talk spoilers. This is me looking at this film as a filmmaker, thinking about sort of the pressures, about inherited momentum, about creative decisions made under very specific circumstances, and ultimately I'm going to look at whether those decisions actually move this franchise forward. At the basic level, the setup is really, really pretty clean. We're still in Britain decades after the rage virus outbreak. The infected are still out there, but the world isn't just broken anymore. It's settled into something colder. The story itself splits pretty clearly down the middle. One thread follows Spike, the teenager who gets pulled into the orbit of Sir Jimmy Crystal, a cult leader, calm. I would argue he's convicted, completely comfortable with cruelty. The other thread follows Dr. Ian KELSON, a scientist who stayed behind to study the infected, especially an alpha infected named Samson. That whole storyline is quite fascinating. Those two paths move forward separately, then eventually they kind of crash into one another, and that's your framework. The movie really isn't interested in plot mechanics. It's interested in where fear lives now. This movie makes a very deliberate decision. The infected are no longer framed as really the primary threat. People are. Not symbolically, practically. Belief systems, ritualized violence, cruelty dressed up as purpose. That's the danger the film wants us to sit with. And on a conceptual level, I understand why. From a writing standpoint, there's only really so far you can push infected horror. Faster, meaner, more aggressive. I think at some point, escalation stops doing the work. So you have to turn inward. It's fair. That move makes sense. What I'm less convinced of is whether it's the right move for this franchise right now. The 28 films were never really shallow zombie movies, but the infected are always the engine. They created urgency, instability, that feeling that everything could collapse in seconds. Even when the films focused on human behavior, it was behavior under pressure, people making awful decisions because time was running out. The Bone Temple eases off that accelerator. It slows things down and it leans into ideology, into belief systems, and that really changes the texture of the franchise, I would argue, in a big bad way. Sometimes that works, sometimes it sort of dulls the edge, but ultimately I think I'm here for the ride regardless, especially with sort of the troubled startup it had. And I really want to stop here for a second because I think this part matters. Nia DaCosta, she was, as a filmmaker, was put in a very tough position. She stepped into this franchise about 3 weeks after 28 years later wrapped. Same world, same continuity, ultimately the same expectations, but she didn't have years to rework the DNA. She inherited momentum that really she had to steer in real time. And to her credit, she didn't try to imitate Danny Boyle. And I would argue that was really a good decision. She made controlled choices, measured choices, I would argue patient choices. And her direction is really composed. There's restraint there. That takes confidence, especially walking into a franchise with this kind of legacy. This is not a director who misunderstood the assignment. Believe me, this is a director who chose to emphasize something different. This is where I shift fully into filmmaker brain. If I were stepping into the series at that momentum, my instinct wouldn't have been to replace the infected as the central problem. It would have been to complicate them, to slow the audience down and force them to look closer. The alpha infected idea is probably the most interesting new concept introduced in this era of the franchise. The suggestion that something human remains, that the virus didn't really erase everything. It's not just horror, that's moral friction. I would have leaned into that discomfort. Not asking whether humans are the real monsters, but asking what happens when killing the infected stops feeling clean. That's a shift only 28 is really positioned to explore. This is where my personal disconnect starts to grow. We've spent a long time culturally in post-apocalyptic stories where humanity becomes the villain. Cults, false prophets, warlords, communities built on fear, the people under the stairs, the people under the hill. The Walking Dead didn't just brush up against this idea, it sort of lived there for a few years, if you recall. When the Bone Temple asks me to emotionally invest in the same terrain, I don't feel challenged. I feel like I've been here before. And familiarity is something this franchise used to actively resist. To be clear, Jack O'Connell is very effective here. Jimmy Crystal is unsettling because he's calm, he's convinced, and ultimately he's positive he's right. And frankly, I think that always plays. The cult sequences are disturbing, sometimes beautifully staged. They really do what they're meant to do. And I just kept wondering whether this was the most interesting threat for this universe at this point in its life, or just the most recognizable one. Visually, the Bone Temple works, period. I don't think anybody else, full stop. It's grotesque, purposefully uncomfortable, more really symbolic than practical in any way, shape, or form. DaCosta knows when to hold on a moment, when to let discomfort sit. From a directing standpoint, there's confidence here. But spectacle by itself doesn't really point a franchise forward. And I kept wanting the film to really push into something messier. If the movie has a center, I would argue that it's Ralph Fiennes, which, I mean, obviously. Dr. KELSON really, he isn't flashy, but he's definitely persistent. His relationship with Samson is, I believe, where the film really feels most alive to me. And I think that's where it feels like 28 again. That uneasy space where compassion starts to clash with survival instinct. That's the road I wish the film had stayed on longer. I think what's ironic is that the film's boldest ideas are the ones it handles most carefully. The infected evolving, humanity still present inside the virus. That's dangerous territory. And I think dangerous is where this franchise has really always been the strongest. Instead, the film settles into commentary that's well executed, but I would say familiar. I mean, I think we definitely tread this territory before. So there you go, now you know. And if knowing is half the battle, you're halfway to being know-it-all yourself. Okay, so 28 years later, The Bone Temple. It's a well-made film. It really is. You have strong performances, there's definitely controlled direction, and I think there's moments that are genuinely unsettling. You know, I respect the craft. I question the focus. I definitely admire the ambition, but I don't fully feel the necessity. So, what's an all index for 28 years later? The Bone Temple. I'm telling you, for everything that I've outlined right now, it's got to be a 7 out of 10. I'm sorry, but you don't get to coast on the strength of the previous film. You still have to show me something a lot harder. Something this franchise isn't already trying to catch up to, while other stories have really been living there for years. So would love to hear your thoughts on the whole thing. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree with my rating, or if you think I'm completely off my rocker. Whatever works for you. All right, guys. I'll talk to you again next time. Never forget.